Good evening. At least it's evening for me while I am making this mini lecture. The topic for this lecture is Henry VIII and the Secularization of Britain. And if you look at the topic heading, it says the Tudors, high point of monarchical power. And certainly there is a nice discussion. It's brief. I wish that Roskin had a little bit more discussion on this topic. But Roskin does point out the important things about Henry VIII, that Parliament got a major boost during the reign of this monarch. But I wish that he had set some context for it because his father, Henry VII, had taken a very different approach. And if you look at the half century before Henry VIII, there were a series of wars called the War of the Roses, which lasted 30 years from 1455 to 1485, and you don't need to know anything about it. I'm not going to ask you about the War of the Roses on an exam. But it was essentially a conflict between the powers of the aristocrats and the powers of the monarch, and it was a very unstable period. There were four royal changes during the era. And out of this conflict came a new royal family that became the royal family in Britain for well over a century, called the Tudors. The Tudor reign began with Henry VII, and then, of course, we have Henry VIII, and then his daughter, Queen Elizabeth. So we have a lengthy uh, period of time in this particular case. But in this situation, Henry VII, who was King of England from 1485 until 1509, he only convened the Parliament 7 times. Remember that Parliament had began really as an extension of the King's Court centuries earlier. The thought of the king was, I can bring my aristocrats together, I can extract resources out of them, I can extract manpower out of them, and I can control them. Of course, Parliament became increasingly independent and was exerting power. And of course, from the perspective of Henry VII, if Parliament is not meeting, then they certainly cannot exercise power. And certainly that allowed him to exercise the primacy of the executive power of the king, limit the power of the legislative check of, in this case, the Parliament. And when Henry VIII became the new King of England, he developed a very different relationship with the Parliament than his father had. When Henry VIII became king in England, there were three power centers. These three power centers had existed for a long time, right? The monarch, Henry VIII, the Parliament, and the Catholic Church. So your book discusses this marriage of convenience between Henry VIII and the Parliament against the Catholic Church. And for Henry VIII, instead of seeing Parliament as an adversary, Henry VIII used Parliament as an ally. In this particular case, Henry VIII got into a battle with the Catholic Church. He wanted a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess that he had married. The church refused to acquiesce to this request and said no. And the result of that was, as Roskin points out, Henry summoned the Parliament and, in essence, cut them a deal. And I'm simplifying and distorting a bit, but essentially, this is the deal that in this particular case, I want you, the Parliament, to pass some laws. I will, of course, accede to these laws, and we will secularize Britain. In other words, we will cut the string attaching us to Rome, to the Vatican, to the Pope. We will create a new church, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, which will be under state control. And the Parliament said, okay, we're willing to go along with this. We'll grant this request. But you have to declare us your co-equal. Now, this is a huge concession because even though kings had shared power with Parliament for a long time, they had never declared Parliament their equal. But in this particular case, Henry VIII does it, proclaims the Parliament as co-equal, and this at least for a short period of time, while he is in power, while his daughter is in power, establishes a new relationship between the monarchy and the Parliament. And of course, this is incredibly significant. England, in your book, also mentions Sweden, right? Countries that secularized early meant that the country had increased sovereignty. It didn't have to worry. Remember that external sovereignty, right? Remember insularity, being protected from outside influences. For many years, countries like Spain and France were influenced heavily by the church. In fact, in France, I have it in your notes, the Catholic Church was the official state religion until the 20th century, until 1905. But in England, this interesting marriage between Henry VIII and the Parliament meant that the state became much stronger than the church very early on, became much more secular. And even though in the 17th century we're going to have a civil war, in essence, between Catholics backing the power of the monarch and Protestants backing the power of the Parliament, um, that was resolved in the next section of your reading on the Glorious Revolution, which I'll get into, not in the next mini lecture, but the lecture after that one. But in countries like France and Spain and Italy, there were centuries-long conflicts between conservative pro-church and liberal anti-clerical forces. I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again right here. Even today, in the 21st century, in 2021, the greatest predictor of how a person will vote in the country of France is the degree of religious conviction. So if you have somebody who considers themselves very Catholic and attends Mass regularly, they are overwhelmingly going to be conservative voters. And people who don't consider themselves religious, who don't go to Mass, for example, and 90% or so of babies are baptized in the Catholic faith. So even though there has been a significant Muslim migration to France, it still is overwhelmingly a Catholic country. But people who don't attend Mass, who are anti-clerical, are much more liberal and much more likely to back legislative power, as opposed to conservatives who have tended to be more pro-executive. So France came to this crossroads much, much later than England. So Henry dies, and his daughter Elizabeth is considered by many to be, if not the greatest, one of the greatest monarchs in British history. Obviously, during her reign, the British in 1588 defeat the strongest at that time navy in the world, the Spanish Armada. I was taught in school, and probably you were too, that Sir Francis Drake, the great English sea captain, defeated the Spanish Armada. In reality, a great storm sunk a lot of the Armada, and Drake mopped up what was left. But with Elizabeth, we see the origins of colonialization, of commerce, eventually a worldwide empire. During her reign, there was an emphasis on military expenses and naval power, which made Elizabeth and the crown heavily dependent on Parliament to raise taxes, which they did routinely and regularly, just like when I mentioned earlier when the king originally convened the Parliament, right, to fight wars in France, the Hundred Years' War. The aristocrats provided that money in return for power, and in this case, Elizabeth called on the Parliament to raise revenue, and they did. However, when Elizabeth died in 1603, she was childless. And so the Tudor dynasty ended, and there was a scramble for who was going to be the next royal family. And in this case, her successors, and in this case, it should be the Stuarts. I'll have to go into the notes and replace that. Her successors were the Stuarts. The Stuarts were Catholic or married to Catholic or had Catholic sympathies. And this is going to create a real rift because the successors, the Stuarts, don't buy into this notion of power sharing. They don't believe in constitutionalism. The Stuarts are going to claim a concept that is seen on the continent of Europe for a long time called divine right. And essentially, their argument was that God had placed them on the throne, not the church, but God himself. And obviously, this is a really intriguing argument because if you believe that, in fact, God has placed you on the throne and your people believe that, you can't be questioned, right? If you're a bad monarch, God will punish you in the afterlife. If you're a good monarch, God will reward you in the afterlife. But in this particular case, this divine right meant that we're not going to share power with you. We are not going to seek your consultation for raising taxes or a military. And in fact, we don't seek your legitimacy on any laws at all. And so the Stuarts decide that they are going to abrogate, they are going to get rid of a 4 centuries old understanding going all the way back formally to the Magna Carta and even before that, that the monarch is not an absolute monarch, that the monarch acts in consultation with the aristocrats, and that there is some level of power sharing, and most meaningful, there are restraints on the political power of the monarch. That's what I called constitutionalism, remember, the restraint of political power. So the Stuarts are saying no deal. We are not going to share political power with anyone, and there are no restraints on our political power. And as you might guess, for people who had shared political power for centuries, when the king decides that there is going to be a new political arrangement, the landed aristocrats in the parliament rebel against this notion, and England ends up with probably its worst century in the last 1,000 years, and that would be the 17th century, which throughout the century has civil war. We even have a brief period of military dictatorship. Now, the century ends well. There's a glorious revolution. Parliament is supreme, and we end up getting a restoration of the monarchy. But it is a very different kind of monarchy, and political development changes in some fundamental ways. And I will get into that in the next lecture. For here, what do you need to know? You need to know that Henry VIII secularizes England, that he makes Parliament his co-equal, and that the early secularization of England is a tremendous benefit to independent political development. And I will get into more in the next mini lecture. Have a wonderful day.